Now to a continuing KARE 11 investigation we call Invisible Wounds. For the past year, our reports have exposed the Minneapolis VA for using unqualified doctors who often misdiagnose veterans with brain injuries.
And now we know the problem is much bigger. Our investigative reporter, AJ Legault, joins us now with just how widespread this problem really is. AJ?
Yeah, Randy, Julie, if it happened here, it's possible, and I'd argue probable, it happened elsewhere. Those are the exact words Congressman Tim Walz used when, in response to KARE 11's reporting, he called for a nationwide investigation into the VA's use of unqualified doctors doing traumatic brain injury, known as TBI exams. Well, tonight we can tell you it's not just a possibility or a probability, but a fact. The windswept plains of the Texas Panhandle is where our continuing investigation takes us. What put us on the road to Amarillo is not the town's famed Cadillac Ranch, but instead its VA hospital.
I'm sorry. You want to reach out and you want to hold them.
That man getting emotional as he talked with us is Dr. Roy Maracas.
You want to take care of them, and the VA's not doing that.
The retired Army colonel with 2 tours of Iraq under his belt is chief of the Amarillo VA's Compensation and Pension Unit. He says the tears are for the fellow veterans he fears had their traumatic brain injuries misdiagnosed.
What they've got to deal with if they're misdiagnosed, they're out in Never Never Land. It's a crime.
What has Dr. Maracas so upset is the discovery that his veterans hospital has been violating the VA's own rule, marked important, that says the diagnosis of TBIs must be made by only 4 types of highly trained specialists. Last year, KARE 11's investigation exposed how the Minneapolis VA used unqualified doctors, even nurse practitioners, in over 300 cases. Better than 1 in 4 of the vets seen by the unqualified doctors were, like Anton Welke, misdiagnosed.
It's a big thing. Sit and wonder in your head, am I nuts?
Veterans denied benefits and treatment for the brain injuries they received serving their country. Which brings us back to Amarillo, Texas, and the first VA insider willing to admit that the same thing's been happening to vets at another VA hospital. The issue of unqualified doctors seeing veterans for TBI exams, it's happening here in Amarillo?
Absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely. Traumatic brain injury exams that were done by people that weren't supposed to do it.
Dr. Maracas told us he'd seen KARE 11's reports.
Has uncovered evidence that the VA has been using unqualified doctors.
So could not stay quiet when he saw emails showing that before he started last May, unqualified doctors had diagnosed 70 veterans in Amarillo alone.
If it's in Minneapolis, if it's in Amarillo, where else is it?
That's the million-dollar question. We filed Freedom of Information requests asking for records from every VA hospital in the country that show how many veterans had their TBI diagnoses done by doctors who, according to the VA's own rules, were not qualified. Those records are just starting to filter in, but we now know what happened in Minnesota happened in Texas and may have happened to veterans at numerous VA hospitals in between.
It's a hell of a lot of people. A hell of a lot. Too many.
Now, we interviewed Dr. Maracas in February. Shortly after that interview, he was demoted from his role as Chief of Compensation and Pension and ordered to spend his days in the library. Internal emails he shared with us indicate Texas veterans could soon begin receiving letters, much like those provided to Minnesota vets, notifying them they're eligible for new TBI testing with a proper specialist.
An update to KARE 11's continuing investigation, Invisible Wounds. We now know unqualified doctors saw veterans in every state in the country for their brain injury diagnosis. Today, VA Secretary Bob McDonald said they let veterans down. Now nearly 25,000 veterans nationwide are being offered new TBI exams. Our AJ Legault broke the story and has more information.
I wish I wasn't here talking to you about this and that we had got it right the first time.
What David McClinican, the VA's Deputy Undersecretary for Disability Assistance, admits they got wrong has been the subject of KARE 11's year-and-a-half-long investigation, exposing the VA not following their own rules when it comes to diagnosing veterans suspected of having traumatic brain injuries.
The expectation was that they should initially see a TBI specialist.
Yes, that was the expectation.
That didn't always happen.
That's correct. From the data that we have now, we know that that did not happen for those 24,000 veterans.
24,905 veterans to be exact. VA policy states only 4 types of highly trained specialists are allowed to diagnose whether a veteran has a TBI. Our investigation identified cases in Minnesota where vets didn't even see a doctor.
It was a nurse practitioner I had.
Shortly after our first report aired, Congressman Tim Walz called for a nationwide investigation.
I think both you and I, when we spoke, when we were first hearing of this in Minnesota, I think the phrase we used was, if it's happening here, it's not only possible, it's probable it's happening elsewhere.
And it was. The VA launched a national review going back to 2007 that was just recently completed. KARE 11 filed Freedom of Information FOIA requests for data showing just how many improper exams were done at every VA facility in every state in the country. Here in Minnesota, we learned 1,059 veterans were impacted. North Carolina had the most, nearly 3,000. Georgia had more than 2,000, and so did Washington State. What we now know is veterans in big cities and small towns all across America will soon be notified they were victims of what the VA calls an injustice.
I'm happy that we've identified this problem and we're attacking it, and I regret that it happened.
Impacted veterans will soon be receiving a copy of this letter in the mail spelling out the options now open to them. They'll have 1 year to respond.
Well, tomorrow Congress holds a hearing into the VA's failure to provide adequate traumatic brain injury exams for veterans, an issue first exposed by the KARE 11 investigative team. Our AJ Legault has continuing coverage tonight of the invisible wounds, and we do want to warn you, this story contains graphic war images.
Pretty much the only thing I could see after the blast happened was the dust and then arterial bleeding on the windshield.
Blood, dust, and twisted metal.
It's amazing what heat and pressure can do to metal. It's a reminder. It's a reminder of
for Green Beret Nate Anderson,
how close you can come.
August 1st, 2008 in Afghanistan was the closest of calls.
So I was sitting right there in the driver's seat, and they had littered the area with IEDs like this one. We hit a pressure plate, which detonated some homemade explosives under my vehicle, and I don't remember a few things after that. I think the fact that I had my helmet on probably saved my life.
A life saved, but changed.
It's embarrassing because I lose what I'm trying to say. I stammer, stuff like that.
Despite what you might suspect, looking at Nate's battlefield photos, everyone in his Humvee survived. A man who lost both legs was medevaced out. Nate and the rest of his Special Forces team continued their mission.
If you could walk and you could answer questions, you're okay.
It wasn't until months later, when he returned home to Minnesota, he acknowledged he was not okay.
So I went to the VA. I just told him I'm having problems with my memory. I'm having problems with headaches, with my speech. What could it be?
Nate was given a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, exam in the Minneapolis VA's Compensation and Pension Department.
And the answer they gave me was that, no, you don't have a traumatic brain injury.
No brain injury treatment and benefits denied. When problems persisted, Nate paid out of pocket to see a brain injury specialist at HCMC.
It was worth it to me to find an answer.
He was diagnosed with a TBI. With this medical evidence, he went back to the VA and appealed his case. Records show the chief of Compensation and Pension, Michael Koopmeiners, a family practice doctor, was his examiner. Despite the HCMC expert's diagnosis, Dr. Koopmeiners found no evidence of TBI during service.
No diagnosis, yeah.
What Nate didn't know at the time is he was the victim of what the Department of Veterans Affairs now acknowledges is an injustice. Nearly 25,000 veterans across the country whose TBI diagnosis was made by doctors who, by the VA's own rules, were not qualified to make them.
These are my medical records from the VA.
KARE 11 first exposed the TBI scandal last year as veterans just like Nate shared their VA records with us.
So, yeah, there you go.
In Nate's case, the records show he appealed his case again, and another unqualified doctor examined him, did no neuropsychological testing, and found no TBI diagnosis.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
In the wake of Carol Evans' reporting, the VA finally had a qualified TBI specialist examine him 7 years after he first went to them for help.
Yeah, 7 years for an answer is quite a while.
Diagnosis: the survivor of this powerful blast has a TBI.
Obviously, I'm relieved to have an answer.
Well, Nate is now receiving the benefits he deserves. Now, he still serves in the National Guard and is a national field director for Concerned Veterans for America, an organization that advocates for VA reform. We'll have coverage of the congressional hearing into the TBI scandal tomorrow on KARE 11.
There was a tenacious young journalist named A.J. Legault who did some really fantastic journalism, some really fair reporting and work at the Minneapolis VA.
Well, on Capitol Hill today, lawmakers praised KARE 11's investigation, Invisible Wounds, which revealed failures in the way the VA handled brain injury exams. In that hearing, Congress pressed the VA on whether it's doing enough to notify veterans they're entitled to new testing. Investigative reporter A.J. Legault joins us with continuing coverage. First of all, congratulations on some excellent reporting, A.J.
Thank you, Julie. Found out I'm young today, too. Well, today, members of Congress holding a hearing into the VA's failure to provide adequate traumatic brain injury exams for veterans. Just this month, letters went out to nearly 25,000 veterans nationwide, notifying them their brain injury diagnosis, or lack thereof, was made by an unqualified doctor. Congress today demanding answers and accountability.
Here I'm reading a news story you probably saw maybe.
Demanding answers, Minnesota Congressman Tim Walz pointing to a story we shared just last night of Special Forces veteran Nate Anderson.
So I was sitting right there.
Who survived this IED blast in Afghanistan.
We hit a pressure plate.
Only to be told by 3 different VA doctors, none of them a TBI expert, that he did not have a brain injury, despite a private HCMC specialist saying he did.
So my question is, what were they missing in the diagnostic piece of this?
So we had a quality review process that perhaps one could say was a little light.
VA Deputy Undersecretary David McClinican acknowledged that when reviewing benefit decisions in the past, the VA didn't always double-check whether doctors were specialists.
Without a doubt, improvement is needed in that area.
Now there's checking every time.
100% quality check.
Why is that important? At the Minneapolis VA, officials disclosed that nearly half of veterans, like Nate Anderson, who were previously told they did not have a TBI,
No diagnosis, yeah.
When re-examined by a specialist, did have a brain injury.
So that's a pretty high number. And we had to attribute that to the fact that it was done by the specialist rather than by a generalist.
The Department of Veterans Affairs sent out letters this month notifying veterans in every state they're eligible for a new exam with a specialist. But committee members today questioning if that's going far enough.
But I'm concerned that it's inadequate.
Before we hold hands on the beach and sing Kumbaya, we need some accountability here.
Well, Congressman Walz did praise the VA for what he labeled increased transparency and taking steps to acknowledge and rectify this injustice. Now, additionally, an Inspector General report launched after our initial reporting could be released later this month.